Hi there, I'm Doug May, and I'd like to welcome you to the second part of our video 2. And in this part, what we want to ask is, how does Churchill Falls and how do the proposed projects fit into meeting Quebec's electricity needs? Okay, so let's get started. So where does the existing Churchill Falls plant fit into the Quebec picture? Well, it has a smaller rated capacity than Robert Bourassa Dam. That is, its capacity is 5,428 megawatt hours compared to Robert Bourassa's 5,616 megawatts per hour. But it likely generates more electricity over a year, especially now with the drought around the James Bay River Basin. So that in fact, in 2024, Robert Bourassa generated about 30 terawatts of electricity. That'd be about 30,000 megawatts of electricity. Whereas even if we calculate the Churchill Falls would have generated about 34,500 megawatts of electricity. So if we assume that 90% of that amount would go to Quebec, that is about 31 terawatts or 31,000 megawatts goes to Quebec, then Churchill Falls would still be the most productive source of electricity for Hydro-Quebec. So it's very important to Hydro-Quebec. Churchill Falls is an older station, and when it was built about 10 years or so before Robert Bourassa, therefore you think the construction costs would be cheaper, if only due to inflation. Now you expect that more of the capital costs have been written off, and that might have affected some of the accounting costs associated with it, the bond financing. We calculated using information from Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro in 2024. I calculated the cost to be about $2.95 per megawatt hour, or 0.295 cents per kilowatt hour. One might ask, that seems a little bit high because they wouldn't have made a profit if they were selling their electricity. That is, the CF Elco was selling its electricity to Quebec for 0.2 cents per kilowatt hour, then it would have been making a loss. But in fact, we know that it made a profit in 2024. And so the costs are a little bit higher than they say. And as we looked at the output prices, the revenue per kilowatt hour was higher than 0.2 cents. And the reason for that sort of guaranteed winter availability. But in addition to that, there are sometimes special arrangements where presumably Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro gives up some of its power, but Hydro-Quebec pays more. So that the amount of revenue was, I think, about 5.5 cents or 5.59 cents per kilowatt hour. In comparison, some sources suggest that the average accounting cost of Robert Bourassa electricity could be 5 to 7 cents per kilowatt hour. I mean, that seems extremely high to me. If you compare 0.3 cents to 5 to 7 cents, that seems too much of a difference. And all I can say is that Hydro-Quebec would know whether that's correct. And so presumably they could give some comments on this video and say, that's not correct. And they could tell me what the actual information is. That would be appreciated. In the next slide, we note that Hydro-Quebec owns about 34.2% of CF Elco, and likely considers it part of its Quebec operations, as I've said before. This comes out of the Labrador boundary dispute of 1927, in which Quebec, in that dispute, believed that the Churchill River Basin was officially part of Quebec. The British Privy Council ruled differently, but it still figures in part of Quebec's perception, and therefore Quebec would see that Churchill Falls is an integral part of its own hydro-generating electricity capacity, and therefore it will force CFLCO to be a cost minimizer. And because Churchill Falls produces such low-cost electricity, then it helps to explain why the household prices for electricity in Montreal, which we observed, are the lowest in Canada in the G7. It's also, we should point out, as part of Quebec's industrial strategy. So the fact that they have so many aluminum smelters in Quebec, I think 7 of the 8 in Canada are in Quebec, then again, it's Churchill Falls helps to explain why they're there. Then again, I would argue the last point, there's an increasing importance of Churchill Falls and the Churchill Falls projects, the proposed projects, because of the growing drought. So the relative importance of Churchill Falls and the projects which were brought out under the Memorandum of Understanding, the MOU, that's increasing in importance. Let's summarize what we know so far about Churchill Falls and how it helps explain why the residential electricity prices to households in Montreal are so low. So the first point is that the Churchill Falls generating station is the most productive generating station in the Hydro-Quebec system, as Quebec would see it and Hydro-Quebec would see it. That is, it provides most of the power of a single generating station, about 17% of the total electricity available to Quebec. But it also does so at the lowest cost available by far. Secondly, that even if the price that Hydro-Quebec pays CFLCO for electricity increases, the effective price only increases by 65.8%. That is Newfoundland share. Why is that? Because Hydro-Quebec is paying itself. And in some of the videos I've seen by Newfoundland and Labrador Power, that doesn't really come out. And so they give you the price that CFLCO is going to come back. So what from Hydro-Quebec's perspective? Because they're owner. Thirdly, the relative importance of Churchill Falls electricity in Quebec is growing, and it will continue to grow as the drought increases or the demand for electricity in Quebec increases, and it's certainly going to increase. The other thing we will note in the next video is that in free markets, which are outside Quebec, primarily with New Brunswick and with the United States, those free market prices in electricity throughout North America are going to increase because of technological change, AI, the greater use of electricity in our everyday lives, for instance, through electric cars, because the populations are expanding. Okay, so it's going to increase. Well, we've just dealt with how the existing Churchill Falls fits into the electricity picture for Quebec. What about the proposed additional generating capacity, which was contained in the Memorandum of Understanding, the MOU? Well, probably the most significant one is a new generating station will be built at Gull Island with installed capacity of about 2,250 megawatts per hour. And then there will be a new powerhouse, I think 2 turbines at Churchill Falls, and that'll add another 1,100 megawatts per hour. And then there will be an upgrade of 550 megawatts per hour. And then, of course, taking Gull Island, connecting out to the grid will be new transmission lines to be paid for by Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro. What we have not been provided with, however, is what's the actual expected generation. And that becomes a little bit difficult, I suspect, because it will be on demand, and they may use it for peak loading periods, in the summer, in the winter, when they'll be running additional power through Churchill Falls in any event, because that's when it's demanded. So we've got the capacity, but we don't have the generation, which we saw for Churchill Falls can be 2 quite different things. Nor do we know the associated prices for each of these electricity projects. Maybe they'll be the same. Maybe they'll be different. And the prices which we're given for existing power, which people have talked about, are fixed annual prices. What Hydro-Quebec is promoting, both for households and for businesses, and certainly what they engage in the free market, particularly in the U.S. market, is dynamic pricing, which can vary, of course, the time of the day, but it certainly will vary on the time of the year when the power is needed, as we've seen, going up. And what I'll talk about in the next video is they've gone up very substantially over the last year during the peak periods. We have not been given estimates of the annual costs associated with these projects. So you say, this is the total cost. Well, when are those costs going to occur? And when you're doing capital budgeting analysis or cost-benefit analysis, taking into account the various time periods, that's extremely important. The bottom line is capital budgeting or cost-benefit analysis cannot be applied. Full stop. So the analysis which you would need in business or in the public sector in order to make a sound decision is not available. Once again, as it's no secret, as Legault has said, Premier, these projects will provide long-term, much-needed cheap power to Hydro-Quebec, therefore its domestic customers. Without it, prices in Quebec for electricity would have to increase by much more than would be the case than if they can get these projects in place. The issue then becomes, how quickly can you get these projects in place? And what Hydro-Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro are advocating is a very aggressive construction project timeline. By the time they're actually commissioned and come on board, it'll be quite a different world from the one which we're living in now. And so any deficiencies in the current agreement that people perceive is going to be magnified 5-10 years from now. Well, in this next slide, I'm coming down to economic analysis, and I just touched on it. That when you're talking about productivity, when you're talking about cost-benefit analysis, when you're talking about capital budgeting analysis, you really want to drill down. You want to deal with the particular generating station. But those data are known by Hydro-Quebec. But as an outsider from an outsider's point of view, as someone of the economists associated with the university, if you don't have that information, there's only so much you can do. The next slides I want is really covering the storyline. What I would do is just to pause what you're listening to, read this yourself, go to the next slide, read that one. And these are the main takeaways. Just pause it now. Same thing with this last slide in the storyline. And now what I'm going to do is tell you about the next video, Hydro-Quebec's export-import prices. Very important video. Thanks for watching and have a good day.